Let's take a look at the basics of modeling assemblies in Creo Parametric. First, I want to show a few different config.pro options. So I'll go to File, Options, and then Configuration Editor. And the first one that I use is Comp Assemble Starts. And I have it set to Move Then Place. And when you start placing components, it's going to attach them to the end of your mouse so you can drop them into the approximate location in space before adding constraints. There's another one called Create Temp Interfaces, and the first time that you assemble a component during your Creo Parametric session, it'll remember how you assembled it and allow you to use that over and over again. And another one is Search Path, and if you're not using a data management system like Windchill, you could use this to direct it to different folders on your computer or your network where you might have components. So let's cancel out of there. To create a brand new assembly, I'm going to click File, New, and change the type to Assembly. And this is going to be an engine, so I'll change the name. That's the file name. You can also use a common name if your standard naming convention is a bunch of numbers and you want to use real words to describe what it is. And here we have the option to use a default template. I'm going to uncheck that just to show you what happens if I use my own custom personal template. So this is going to give me a number of different things to start with. First off, if I turn on my datums, I get a bunch of default datum planes and my default default coordinate system. If I go to my properties dialog box, it also establishes what unit system that I am using. And also you can have different predefined parameters and relations, and also your layering scheme for how you want to organize the different objects. And I have my default template set up for model-based definition, so I have a bunch of different combination states in here as well. So now that we have our engine assembly started with our default template, it's time to start bringing in components. So I will click the Assemble button to do that. And you'll notice in the tooltip that in Creo Parametric 4.0 and later, A is the keyboard shortcut for getting to that command. So I will click Assemble, and in my working directory, I'm going to start off with the left side of the crankcase. And I'll double click on it. Like I mentioned, because of that config.pro option that I have turned on, the component is attached to the end of my mouse, and I can just left click to drop it somewhere. And you notice that we have this dragger on the computer screen that allows us to translate the component as we're placing it. Also, you can rotate it to different angles, and this is very convenient when you're trying to position it before adding constraints. You can even do in plane motion with some of these other different controls. For the first component though, probably 98% of the time or more, you're going to align the component's default datum planes with the default datum planes of the assembly, and that's called the default constraint. To get to the default constraint, there's a drop-down list over here. You could choose default, but since it's so common, you can also hold down the right mouse button in order to get to it. And one of the biggest mistakes I see with new users creating assemblies is that they don't assemble the first component. And at the end of the demonstration, I'll show you what that would end up looking like. So I'll choose default constraint. And on the dashboard, we notice that the status changes to fully constrained, and the component color changes to orange to indicate that it is located in our model. So that's good. To finish off placement, I can click the check mark, or middle mouse button will do the same thing. And to reduce screen clutter, I'm going to turn off the display of my datums. So there I have my first component placed here in the model. Now let's place the second component. So for this one, let's click the Assemble button. And this is going to be the right side of the crankcase. And again, I've got it attached to my mouse, and I can just drop it where I want to. And then to help facilitate placing it correctly, I can start using the dragger to position it approximately where I want. And so when you are defining constraints, you are going to select reference geometry from the component that you're assembling and reference geometry from the assembly in order to define its location. And typically with static components, we're adding enough constraints to remove all 6 degrees of freedom. A component has 3 translational and 3 rotational degrees of freedom. And so for this one, first I'm going to select this cylindrical surface, and you'll notice that I have a little rubber band effect with this set of dashed lines that are stretching out, and then I can use it to highlight what I want to assemble it to, and I'll click there, and right now it's giving me a coincident constraint between those 2 surfaces. And then I can start defining my second constraint. Maybe I'll pick this flat surface and this one over here. And it says it's fully constrained because it's allowing assumptions. It's not caring about the rotation angle, but that's not correct. That's not how I want it placed in here. So sometimes when you have allow assumptions correct, it's not going to give you the right thing. So you can right click and hold and turn off assumptions. You can also do that from the placement tab on the dashboard. And I can tell Creo Parametric that I want to add another constraint. I'm going to pick this cylindrical surface and that cylindrical surface, and it gives me an oriented constraint, and that looks correct for how I want it placed in the model. And so again, now that I'm happy, I'm going to hit the check mark to place it in there. So 2 components in here. Next up, before I start assembling more components, I do want to mention that there are some assembly settings for your session. If I go to File and then Options, here we have Assembly, and here at the top we have Reference Creation and Backup Control. That's for external references and top-down design. But I want to scroll down in here and show you that we have options for component dragging, when we're moving it in here, and also automatic placement options. If you're using some of those different temporary interfaces, here's the option for controlling that. So again, you can set these different things from config.pro options. You can also change your assembly placement settings during your session. So let's cancel out of there. Now I'm going to assemble a couple of cylinders on top of here. So let's click the Assemble button, and I'm going to grab cylinder.prt, and again, let's position it approximately where we want it to be. And for the first constraint, I want to line up this cylindrical surface with a cylindrical surface over here. And I recommend that you concentrate on the geometry that you want to align, and also think about how you would assemble this in the real world. Alternatively, rather than picking geometry first, you can pick one of your different constraints that defines the relationship between the geometry. One of the most common ones is coincident, so that'll make 2 flat planar surfaces lie in the same plane, or if you have 2 cylindrical surfaces or conical surfaces, it will line up the axes. Similar to coincident is distance. Rather than making 2 entities lie in the same plane, you can define a distance between them. Angle offset, like the name implies, you define an angle. Parallel, you make them, well, essentially parallel to each other. You just don't care about the distance. Very similar to distance, except you're not going to specify a numerical value. Normal makes them perpendicular to one another. You can see tangent in here. So we have about a dozen different constraints. But again, rather than picking the constraint first, I typically start focusing on geometry. So I'm going to pick this cylindrical surface over here and this cylindrical surface over there. Then I'm going to pick the 2 planes that I want to line up. So I'm going to pick this surface over here. I want to pick a surface on the underside. You could either use query select, tapping with the right mouse button, or if you click on this button on the dashboard, you can display the component in what's called an accessory window, and you can resize it. And that's very convenient because it allows you to rotate the model in its own separate window as opposed to doing it in the main window. And so let's pick this surface over here. Right now, Creo Parametric thought I wanted an angle offset. That's not what I want. I actually want them to be coincident. So there it moves it into the right place. And because I turned off assumptions, it keeps assumptions turned off. If I turn assumptions back on, it says, hey, that's all that you need to assemble it. But the problem is I'm not sure that the holes are lined up because I haven't controlled the rotation angle. So what I'm going to do in order to facilitate picking the holes that I want to line up, here you'll notice for the second constraint, we have a checkbox with a constraint enabled. By unchecking that, I can then translate it, which can help me. And now I can add my other constraint. I can say, let's line up this hole and this hole over here. Gives me that oriented constraint. Now I can go back to that constraint that I disabled and re-enable it. And now I've got the component in the correct location. So that's good. I will hit the check mark. And so I've got my cylinder in there. 1 second, because all my colors are the same color as the background screen, I'm going to go to File, Options, and then System Appearance, Graphics. Let me change my background color to a little bit of a grayish color for some more contrast. All right, so for assembling the cylinder again, rather than hitting the assemble button and then defining my constraints, I can repeat this component because I want to use essentially the same constraints as before. And so I can click on the component and then hold down the right mouse button. And here we have the repeat command, and it'll list the different constraints. I'm going to select all 3 constraints and then click the add button. And first it's highlighting the cylindrical surface and then a flat surface, and finally the hole that I'm going to line up. And so that is very quick and easy for getting this component in there again. And I could continue adding the cylinder as many times as I want using this repeat component dialog box, but I only want it in there one other time. All right, so let's click the OK button and let's do a few more constraints, or excuse me, components in this assembly. Then I'm going to create a subassembly and place it. So the next component is going to be the cam cover. And for this one, let's select flat surface over here and flat surface over there. And I'm going to turn off the display in the sub window. Oops, I turned off the display in the main window. In the sub window over here, let me make sure that for moving it around, if I hold, I can also use the Control and the Alt key, Control, Alt, and right mouse button for translating it to moving it approximately where I want it to be. Oops. So for this one, this has some curved surfaces in it, and so I'm going to define a new constraint. Oops. There we go. Move it approximately where I want. I'm going to define a new constraint, and let's choose the edge from the selection filter because I know I only want to pick edges. I want to line up, say, this edge and this edge over here. And let's see, let's drag it down approximately. And again, because I have curved surfaces here, I'm not picking the flat surfaces. Usually if you have a choice between surfaces or edges, you want to pick surfaces. And so let's pick that edge there. And I'm going to use the selection filter again to change this to edge. There we go. And now I've used edges to line up where that component should be. That's good. Let's hit the check mark over here. And another component in this one. We'll attach the blower to the cam cover. And again, let's position it approximately how I want it to be. And let's pick this cylindrical surface and line it up with that over there. Let's pick this flat surface. Again, open up it in its own sub window. Helps me pick this surface over here. Right now it's suggested normal. That's not what I want. And you can also double click on the 3D note in the graphics area to access the constraint. It also lists the geometry that you're using. And from here we can say, hey, I want to use a coincident constraint instead. And right now it's in here, but it's rotated incorrectly. So let's right mouse click and hold again turn off assumptions, and I'm going to add a new constraint. And this one, let me close this little window over here. I'm going to take this surface and this surface, and rather than angle offset, again, I can double click on the note, and so let's just make those parallel. That's good. That's how I want it in here. So I will hit the check mark, and my engine is starting to come together. And before I put in the next components, I'm going to create another assembly and then place it in here as a subassembly. So let's create new, and this is going to be for my carburetor and air intake. And again, I'm not going to use the default template. I'm going to use my own oops, I accidentally chose to create a part. Let's cancel out of there. Let's do file new, change the radio button to assembly. And again, this is the carb air intake. And I'm using my own personal default template. Let's hit the assemble button. And first off, we are going to start with the manifold. And again, for the first component, most of the time you can just use the default constraints. And let's hit the check mark, and it's located in here. Now for the second component, I'm going to assemble the carburetor. And for this one, let's see, taking a look at how I want to assemble it in here. I'm going to select, let's do, yeah, that looks correct. Let's select this cylindrical surface and this cylindrical surface. And right now it's giving me coincident. Let me turn off the display in the accessory window. And I'm going to use Control and Alt and left drag it to drag it up over here. And for the next constraint, let's pick this flat surface. Oops. And that flat surface over there. And it looks like I have it oriented incorrectly. Yeah, it looks like I got the wrong holes lined up. All right, no problem. Let's go and I deleted that first constraint over there. And so I can disable the constraint just so I can get to the holes, and say for the new constraint, let's pick this cylindrical surface there, that cylindrical surface. And actually, before I enable that constraint, let's do another new constraint. I'm going to line up this surface here and this bolt surface. Now I can go back, enable that constraint. There I have it placed the way I want it to. So again, sometimes when you're assembling, you're like, hey, I accidentally picked the wrong stuff. You might delete constraints and then put in the correct one that you want, or change the references that you're using. All right, last one that's going to go into this carburetor assembly. Let's assemble the scoop. And for this one, let's see, let's have it pointing, say, this direction. And again, I'll pick cylindrical surface there, cylindrical surface there, and let's pick a flat surface there, flat surface there. And we just have assumptions turned off. So let's do a new constraint, and let me disable the first one. I really like this disabling, so I can, oh, actually the first one's good. Let's disable this one so I can translate it up. And for the new constraint, that surface to make it oriented in the correct direction. Go back and enable that coincident constraint, hit the check mark, and now I've got my carb air intake created. Let's hit the save button for this one to put it into my working directory. And Now let me close this window, back to my engine window. Let's hit the assemble button. And this time I'm assembling a subassembly, another assembly, into my main assembly. I'll click the open button and let's put it right about over here and then rotate it so we get it approximately the way that we want it to be. And so for this one, I'm going to line up the cylindrical surfaces first. This surface and that surface over there. Let's add in a new constraint. By the way, the reason I'm clicking new constraint is a lot of times if you pick cylindrical surfaces followed by cylindrical surfaces, Creo Parametric might think that you're trying to make changes to the first constraint, but I like right-clicking and choosing new constraint to make it explicitly known to Creo Parametric that I am trying to create a second constraint that is also using cylindrical surfaces. So let's pick that surface there and that surface over there, and I'll just go to picking a flat surface. Since I'm choosing a different kind of surface, I didn't need to do new constraint. So that's good. Now we have our carburetor subassembly in there. So let's hit the check mark. And that is all the components that I am going to place in here. And so there are a few other things I want to point out about assembly modeling. First off, if I expand these different components in here, I have what's called a placement folder that will allow me to access the constraints right from the model tree. And let me scroll down over here. So for example, if I go to the cylinder component over here, again, we have a, oops, went too far. We have a placement folder, and we can see that we have 3 different coincident constraints. And as you click on them, they highlight on the computer screen. And as I showed in another tips and tricks video, you can also use the repeat command right from individual constraints, which can be a lot faster than using the repeat command like I did it in this video here. All right, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that one of the biggest mistakes that new users in Creo Parametric make is that they don't use the default constraint or any constraints for the first component. Let me edit definition of the first component that's placed in here, and I am going to go to the placement tab and delete this default constraint and hit the check mark. And now what you'll notice is that the first component has an empty box next to it, meaning that it's under constrained, in this case completely unconstrained, and all the components that are assembled to it have a double box next to them. Let me try to blow this up and so you can see in there the box next to another box indicates that it is assembled to an under constrained component. So again, if you see this in your model tree, the most likely cause is that the user did not assemble the first component. And again, the overwhelming majority of the time, you should be able to use the default constraint for the first component. Now you'll notice those little glyphs, as they are called, went away from the model tree. And the last thing that I want to mention is from the Tools tab, there is a Bill of Materials command, and we can do it for the top level or an individual subassembly. You can choose which other components you are including, but I'm just going to go with the default. And by that, we can see this BOM report be generated in the embedded browser. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindchill.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and click the subscribe button. And please write a comment to let me know if I should make more videos like this. Thank you very much.